We're back with more phonology today. We're going to talk about natural classes and distinctive features as well. If you'll pardon me for a moment, I'll get a bit nostalgic here. This is kind of a funny lecture for me because, as you can see, it's dated March 11th, 2020. That's what the date was the last time I gave this lecture, which was the last time I lectured in front of a class for 201. And then the very next day, we shut the whole thing down. So it was kind of an odd time, and it's kind of an odd time for me now because I'm actually, I think as I've mentioned before, recording these lectures over the summer, and this is the last lecture I'm going to record in this fashion over the summer, and then we'll kind of go back to the lectures that I recorded in March in the previous version of 201, so it's kind of coming full circle for me. I'm also finally heading off 2 days from now to go reunite with my wife who's been in Ukraine since March, so after 5 months I'm finally going to see my wife and my daughter again, which is nice, to put it mildly. So I'm happy to kind of bringing some closure to this phase of life at this point in time, although the pandemic will still go on. Anyways, 5 months ago on March 11th, I remember trying to make some jokes about the disease because everybody was kind of really freaked out about it at the time, and you can kind of get the sense of foreboding that things were about to happen that were bad, and they did. So I don't want to make light of that, but that will explain why I have these next two slides in this lecture, which were kind of put in there to, number one, acknowledge the scariness and also to kind of try to lighten the mood. Also, usually this lecture comes shortly after I grade the midterm, or we successfully grade the midterm. Hopefully that's happened by the time we're in the middle of the fall semester. I can't make any promises now in August, though, but that's usually the plan. But the kind of joke behind this is that in 341 Intro Phonetics, I teach students to draw mid-sagittal diagrams, or at least I attempt to, which is where you sort of draw what the mouth is doing when you are producing particular sounds or symbols in the IPA. And ideally, they're supposed to kind of look like this. This is a theta, so it's a voiceless interdental fricative. So this student has done a good job of pointing or drawing the tongue in between the two sets of teeth here to make the frication part of this sound. There's also voicelessness, which is represented by just a straight line here for the vocal folds, and otherwise the vocal tract looks pretty nice, kind of the way you want it to have it all lined up. There's the velum blocking off the passageway through the nose. But drawing is hard, or at least maybe not everybody has the same level of drawing ability as this student does, and sometimes can get a bit humorous, the way people imagine the human face to look like. And it's also kind of funny to look at these around sort of Halloween time, because so these are not creatures you might want to meet in a dark alley, I suppose. Right, so some of these are supposed to be palatal nasals, some of these are supposed to be interdental fricatives. Either way, some of them they're all dramatic. This person said drawing is hard. Yep, that's true, I'd agree with you. I'm not very good at these myself. And this person said, moral of the story is that tongues are effing weird. And that is true, but we can use them to our advantage, which is great, because that's how we speak. That's what we do every day of our lives. That's a lot of what language is all about. Okay, we're going to explore a new dimension of what language is all about, or phonology is all about, in this lecture. And to talk about it, I kind of want to go back to this idea of patterns of patterns. So what have we learned so far in phonology? Basically, we've learned that sounds will exhibit patterns in language, and that they can sometimes change according to their contexts. We talk about this in terms of different distributions of phonemes or individual allophones of phonemes. So the rules sometimes for one phonemes distribution can be identical to the rules for another phonemes distribution, the rules being a way to describe the changes that the phonemes undergo in different phonetic environments. So we've noted that we have this allophone, or phoneme T, which becomes an unaspirated T after S, like in stop. But usually when it's at the beginning of a stressed syllable, or just an individual or one-syllable word like top, it is an aspirated T. So we've talked about that pattern at length. I even burned a couple matches to show it to you, so I'm not going to go back to that again. But I could have done the same demo with P's. So the P phoneme is unaspirated after S, like in the word spat. But if we pronounce P at the beginning of a word like pat, then it is aspirated. So we got the same sort of pattern as this pattern up here for the T, and we get the same sort of pattern as well for a K. So after an S, like in scar, it's unaspirated, but just by itself at the beginning of a word like car, it's aspirated. So in every single case, each one of these sounds by itself at the beginning of a word or at the beginning of a stressed syllable is aspirated, but after in an S, in sort of the onset of a word, it is unaspirated, or all these are unaspirated. So they're all kind of doing the same thing. Why is that? Well, we don't necessarily need to know exactly why so much as we need to sort of recognize the pattern of the pattern. So the way we're going to talk about that is by referring to the concept of natural classes. P, T, and K form a natural class of sounds in English. They have features that they all share in common that no other sound in English has. So P, T, and K are all voiceless stops, and no other sound in English is a voiceless stop. That makes these three sounds what we call a natural class. So I'll redefine that again because I want you to be able to remember this and actually apply this concept to multiple different phonology problems that we'll work on. But a natural class is a set of sounds in a language that shares one or more phonetic features to the exclusion of all other sounds in that language, which means that these are sounds which have something in common and no other sound in that language has those features in common. This turns out to be useful or enlightening, I guess you could say, because natural classes of sounds are going to typically function together in phonological rules. The rules or patterns we observe in terms of how sounds change according to their phonetic environments, they will apply not just to one sound in many cases, but to a group of sounds that are normally defined by a natural class or the features that they share in common. So in order to sort of be able to describe those natural classes, we need to talk a bit about what features they have in common. And normally, or the easiest way to get into it is to say that, well, the features that they're going to share primarily include the phonetic labels that we've already learned, the various dimensions of articulation like voicing, manner of articulation, place of articulation, or when we talk about vowels, things like height, front, backness, rounded, tense, lax, that sort of thing. But we need to make some additions to this. So these features are going to be defined not necessarily by like what people do when they actually produce the sounds, what they're moving around in their mouths, what gestures they're making with their particular articulators. It's not defined phonetically like that, what we can observe in terms of physical reality. Instead, these are going to be defined more abstractly by what patterns together, what sort of features get used to contrast between one group of sounds and the next. So unfortunately, we have to learn kind of a similar but somewhat different set of features to make these descriptions to sort of pick out these various natural classes of sounds. Excuse me. So I'll give you a few natural class examples, and then we'll kind of walk through a few questions about them to hopefully learn how to identify natural classes or what features or pick out certain classes of sounds in phonology. But walk through another, or two examples, and then I'll have you guys try to answer three questions. So K, G, and Engma, K, G, Engma. If you actually pronounce all those, you can feel that they are the natural class of velar stops in English. So K is a velar stop, it's voiceless. G is a velar stop, it's voiced. Engma is a velar stop, it's a nasal. These two are also oral sounds because air does not flow through the nose. And this one's voiceless and this one is voiced. But all of them are velar stops. And there's no other sound in English that's a velar stop. Like in theory, you could possibly have a voiceless nasal velar stop, but we don't in English, so we don't have to worry about that. Give you another example. The natural class of rounded tense vowels in English is just these two, oo and o. They happen to be back in either high or mid, depending on which one you're talking about. But if you just say that they're rounded and tense, that picks out these two alone, and there are no other vowels in the English language that are both rounded and tense. Those are two examples of natural classes. Okay, let's try to work backwards or go from the set to figure out what features apply to them or define them. Let's say we have T and S. What are the features that define those two sounds as a group? I think I'll probably just pause here, go back to my trusty old glass of water, and maybe we can think about this to try to figure out what the answer would be. And I'd say one way to kind of walk into it that would hopefully show you what the pattern is to just describe these sounds according to their phonetic features as a way to start identifying which features might be relevant. So T, and usually the easiest way to describe these phonetically is to say, okay, what's its voicing? So T is voiceless. What's its place of articulation for a consonant? It's alveolar. And then what's its manner of articulation? A T is a stop. So voiceless alveolar stop. We can do the same thing for S. It's a voiceless alveolar fricative. And so now we know, well, both of these things are voiceless and alveolar. They differ in terms of being a stop or a fricative. Is there any other sound in English which is voiceless and alveolar? Can you think of any? If you happen to know the entire consonant chart by now after the midterm, that's great. That's kind of why I want you to learn that, so you didn't have to think about this too much. But if you don't know it by memory exactly, it's okay at this point to go to the sort of consonant chart and look it up. Can you find any other sounds which are voiceless and alveolar in the language? I'm going to be willing to bet that you cannot, because these are the only two. So that's what makes these two a natural class. And I think I might actually pick out that chart if I can find it, because that might be a useful way to walk through this. So the next set is the V, the EV, the Z, and the J. What ties all of those together? And let's see if I can dig up the consonant chart. Lo and behold, oh, I almost forgot. Before you watch this lecture, you should do a quick write. This one's about Arabic and the Arabic definite article the, which is normally al with a glottal stop at the beginning, and then in some contexts it appears as al, and in other contexts the last consonant seems to change in that definite article. Why is that change happening? It may have something to do with the word that it is attaching to, sort of like allomorphy, as we saw way back when we were doing morphology. So try to figure out what's going on there before you watch this lecture. We'll get to the answer here in a few slides. Going back to this question in terms of what are the what are the features which tie this group of sounds together as a natural class? So we got the v, the, z, and zh. And they're actually kind of nicely lined up here in this particular row in the table, which helps us sort of understand what makes this a natural class, right? So they are voiced fricatives. So V is a voiced labial-dental fricative. EV is a voiced interdental fricative. They change, or they differ in terms of place of articulation. Z is a voiced alveolar fricative, and zh is a voiced post-alveolar fricative. I hope I said Z was voiced, but it is. It's a voiced fricative. That's what these guys are in terms of their natural class. And then lastly, we have I, and A. What are these guys all about? So with vowels, you have 4 different features you have to worry about to describe them. So I is a high front, unrounded, lax vowel. So there's a lot going on there. Is a mid, front, unrounded, lax vowel. A is a low front, unrounded, lax vowel. So there's kind of 2 ways you can wind up describing these. The simpler version is to say I, and A are the front lax vowels in English. They also happen to all be unrounded. So in this particular case, if you want to say they're low front, front, lax, and unrounded, that's fine. If you're still being accurate by saying that they are the front lax vowels in English, then I'm not going to count anything off in your homework if you do that. That still defines the same natural class. It's correct either way you say it, just because that's the way English happens to work. Other languages it might be different. But that's usually a concern when we go through the homeworks for these, which is to say how many features do I need to use to describe these classes. And I would say, when in doubt, use all of the features which are appropriate for that natural class of sounds. In a lot of phonology or phonological analysis, they try to make the explanations as sort of parsimonious as possible, as we say, so use the least amount of information to get the same result. I'm not going to be super picky about that in this class, but just so you know, that's kind of like an ideal, like analytical ideal in phonology, is to use fewer features if you can, but it's okay with me if you use all the features which give you the same result here. Okay, and I also think it's useful to list them all out, because you don't know ahead of time, if you're not used to doing this, which ones might be relevant and which ones they might share in common, which ones they might not. Okay, why are we doing this other than for the logical puzzle value of the exercise? It turns out it's actually useful because phonological patterns are often formed by natural classes of sounds. And we have some examples in English that we've seen already, but now will become sort of more obvious once you understand sort of what the natural classes are that come into play for certain types of English allomorphy. So we had a pattern of the English past tense a while back. Again, we were talking about allomorphy at the end of the morphology unit. And normally, the sort of regular English past tense morpheme is just a D when you go from like the verb study to studied for the past tense, or feared to feared. You just add a D as a suffix to both of those forms to get this past tense. And there's little spelling differences in the way that English is spelled, but we already know that English is not a great language for clear spelling, so don't worry about those. Just worry about what sounds are becoming involved in this particular case. And for the first allomorph of this morpheme, it's just the D by itself as a suffix. Male goes to male, lone goes to lone, so on and so forth. The second allomorph has a little I right before it. So there's a vowel plus a D. We get this when we go from the verb collect to collected, or mate to mated. We're adding another syllable here, wade to weighted, or need to needed. What is going on here in these forms? Why are we adding the I part of this when we have this second set of forms? Why is this operating in different fashion than the first allomorph where we just add the D? What do you think? What do these verbs have in common down here that the verbs up here do not? You should think about this in terms of natural classes. Hopefully I framed that obviously enough for you. But there's a natural class of sounds which you find at the end of the verbs here in set number 2, which distinguish these root morphemes from all of the other verbs in the other set. And what's going on here basically is that each one of these ends in an alveolar stop, either T or D. It's got to be an oral alveolar stop, because technically speaking, in the N in lone is an alveolar stop, except it's nasal. So these are oral stops, either the voiceless one, T, or the voiced one, D. So collect ends in a T, mate ends in a T, need ends in a D, so on and so forth. Whenever you get that, you're going to add another I before the D in the past tense morpheme. Again, this is probably sort of so that you can separate the past tense morpheme, both in terms of articulation and in perception, so that you can kind of distinguish it or hear it as distinct from the alveolar stop, which ends the root form of the verb, right? And what happens here is kind of funny, like in mated or needed. This alveolar stop at the end of the root of the morpheme verb, the root verb here, mate or needed, becomes a flap in this context, because you have stress on the first syllable, mated or needed, and then going from a stressed to unstressed syllable, the alveolar stop turns into a flap on the surface. Same thing with weighted. Collected gets a little bit awkward because it's hard to produce a flap in that context, or English speakers just don't do it. So that one's relatively simple to kind of see. I kind of over-talked it, I guess you might say, by explaining it at some length to make it as clear as possible. But it's basically T and a D operating as a special group here. They're both oral alveolar stops, and so we can describe that in terms of our phonetic features. But like I said, sometimes we'll see natural class patterns that you can't really rely strictly on phonetics to explain. These features usually are a little more general. And I'm glad that I caught the Arabic quick write before I walked into this slide, because that's what this quick write is supposed to show you, basically. So in Arabic, if we'll go to this one over here, come on. We have what are called the sun and the moon letters. So I said the moon letters are the basically the forms over here on the left, where we get the sort of underlying or expected form of the definite article in Arabic, al, and that ends in an L in every single case. But over here for the sun letters, that last L in the definite article changes its phonetic form to be a different sound depending on what the noun that it precedes begins with. So if the word begins with an esh, as in sun, which is shams in Arabic, then al isn't pronounced as al, it's pronounced as ash. Or if it's the house, which is dar, then it becomes ad-dar, so on and so forth. Z changes, or L changes to a Z in front of a Z, so on and so forth, all the way through this. And then Arabic has some fun other sounds which we haven't talked about in English. So like the Q symbol is a voiceless uvular stop, kamar. I don't speak Arabic as usual, like all these other languages I'm giving you examples for, but it's way back there in your throat, further back than a velar stop. There's also a voiceless pharyngeal fricative even further back than a Q, an uvular, so on and so forth. The trick is, like, why are these changes happening to the L in this particular case? And hopefully you can see, maybe I'll make that a little bit bigger, is that there's a connection being made here between the final consonant of the definite article and the first consonantal sound of the noun that it is preceding, right? So they become the same. The L doesn't just stay as an L. If it's before an esh, it becomes an esh. If it's before a D, it becomes a D, so on and so forth. So that by itself is a pattern known as assimilation. I'll have more to say about that in a second. But what sorts of sounds are inducing that change? So here we have esh, D, Z, N, and theta. And over here we have sounds which don't induce that change. That's the uvular stop, the labiodental fricative, the velar stop. These are all voiceless. Actually, everything here is voiceless. So voiceless pharyngeal fricative, the glottal stop, so on and so forth. The ones over here, maybe you saw this when you were giving the quick write a try, but they're all produced more or less in the front of the mouth, or at least with the front of the tongue. So there's a little bit of differentiation in the place of articulation for these guys. So esh is post-alveolar, the D is alveolar, the Z is alveolar, this is also alveolar. This one's interdental, the theta. But none of the ones over here are produced with the front of the tongue, so to speak. So ka and ka are with the back of the tongue, as is the pharyngeal ha. And the glottal stop isn't produced with the tongue at all. The F is not produced with the tongue at all. None of these use the front of the tongue. So we need to have some sort of way of describing these guys as a group to say that, well, they're going to function together potentially. So the sun letters over here include alveolars, post-alveolars, and interdentals. Those are sounds made with the front part of the tongue, and the moon letters are going to include everything else. So they're like the elsewhere condition in the Batman analogy. So we'll, to describe this, come up with a new feature. We're going to call it coronal, because that's what everybody else does. And that's a cover term for a feature describing alveolars, post-alveolars, and interdentals. It's just a cover term for any sound made with the front part of the tongue. All right. So you kind of have to be able to keep this information in mind in the background, because that's how this all works phonetically. But phonologically, we can get patterns of patterns for these different places of articulation such that coronal sounds can function together like in Arabic. I want to go back to that point I made about assimilation a second ago. So this is what's happening in Arabic. The change is called assimilation. And generally speaking, assimilation is when one sound becomes more similar to another in its environment. In the Arabic case, what we see is what's called total assimilation. I guess I can sort of highlight this as well. And what total assimilation means is that you have the entire sound changing to be identical to a sound in its environment. Yeah, assimilation, you can kind of think of it as like if you were to sort of move into a new environment or new country or something like that, and then change your way of living such that it assimilates to sort of the way people live in your new environment. That's a term used outside of linguistics in that sense. It means to become more similar to. So the yeah, you can kind of see the root of similar here. Hopefully, there's actually a prefix here, add, from Latin again as well. That's harder to see, but the D and the prefix add becomes an S because it's before an S, just like we see in the Arabic assimilation case. So there's actually assimilation in assimilation itself. If that helps you remember it, then great. Otherwise, just note that like some sounds are going to change to be more like other sounds in their environment. Sometimes it changes the entire sound. Other times it changes just a feature of the sound, which is what we see in place assimilation. So in English, for instance, we get place assimilation for the consonant N, which in formal or casual speech can take on the place of articulation of a following consonant. And this is kind of subtle. There's more sort of formal ways to do this that we've seen before, like with the in and like inaccurate going to like ill and illegible, or ir and irregular. That's a form of total assimilation. In terms of place assimilation, you can see that for examples like in going to im before possible. So inaccurate but impossible. The N changes to an M before a P because those are both bilabial consonants. At a less formal level, in casual speech, we see that happening with like the un and unpleasant. If you say it real quick, you could say unpleasant, and most people wouldn't notice that the N got replaced with an M there. Or engrossed, the N can change into an engma before the velar g, because engma is a velar nasal stop and g is a velar voiced stop. All that's happening here is that we're getting a connection in place of articulation between these guys. These two are bilabial. These two are velar. Yeah, that's what it means to undergo place assimilation. You change your place of articulation to be more like the place of articulation of another sound right next to you. Okay, here's another assimilatory pattern that we get in English. Let's see if you can discern this one. So if we have a word cat, we can make a plural form out of it by saying cats. If we have a word like dog, then we can make it plural by saying dogs. Or we can go from match to matches, judge to judges, chair to chairs, pass to passes, hose to hoses, puck to pucks, so on and so forth. So we're making all of these words plural, but we do it in a slightly different way for different forms, right? So for cat, we add an S. For dogs, or for dogs, yeah, we add the Z. For judges, we're adding an is. Passes, we add an is, so on and so forth. Why is it not consistent? Why are we getting different forms? Yeah. What do you think? Normally in class, I might have to wait a while before somebody gets up the courage to answer that question. Hopefully you can see at least one of these patterns pretty straightforwardly, though, now that we know to think in terms of features in describing these patterns. But the basic form of the plural is generally described as Z. That's the suffix we add to a word like chairs or dogs. The basic form, though, is always exhibiting voicing assimilation, no matter what you think of it as. So if you add it to a root which ends in a voiceless sound, like cat or puck, both of these are ending in a voiceless stop, then what we add instead of the Z form of this, instead of the voiced alveolar stop, we add the voiceless, instead of the voiced alveolar fricative, we add the voiceless alveolar fricative S, right? So T is voiceless, S is voiceless. G is voiced, Z is voiced. so on and so forth. So they're matching in terms of their voicing quality. That's a form of voicing assimilation. But there's more going on here, right? So that explains these 4 monosyllabic forms we get: cats, dogs, chairs, and pucks. They just have to match in voicing at the end there. But what happens with matches, judges, passes, and hoses? Okay, I'm going to walk you through all this again on the next slide. But there's this other allomorph that we get for this particular suffix, the plural morpheme. When it attaches to roots that end in specific types of sounds like ch, j, s, z, it surfaces as is, right? And it, again, has to do with these particular sounds. So we have this sort of default pattern of, it should match in terms of voicing, but we can't really get that to work here because these 2 sounds are not sort of right next to each other in the matches or judges case. For matches, since this ends in a voiceless affricate, you might expect an S here, but there's this I that intervenes between them. So that doesn't seem to be relevant anymore. The real question is, why do we get this I intervening between them? And one way to think about it is basically this Z sound is similar in a crucial way to the sounds that end these 4 forms: match, judge, pass, and hose. And what happens for all 4 of those words is that they're ending in what's called a strident consonant. So ch, j, s, and z are strident sounds. This is a new feature that is not part of phonetics, at least not the way we've learned it, but it's operative in phonology, right? Hopefully you can hear that as well. So s, z, I mentioned before when we were doing phonetics, those are loud fricatives. Ch, j, zh, sh. Any fricative that ends, it's basically, it's a type of coronal fricative, but it's a fricative in which you're sort of blowing air against the back of your upper row of teeth, which it's a really loud or noisy fricative, especially at high frequencies. You don't need to worry about those technical details so much if you can just sort of keep in mind that these are all strident consonants. Sh, z, z, sh, and zh. And you can see that easily in the phonology because it's inducing this change where we get is here rather than S or Z by itself. Okay, like I said, this is a type of coronal consonant, or only coronal consonants can be strident, and the strident part of that means that they're noisy. You can get interdental fricatives are also coronals, but they're not strident, so that's one distinction you can make there. We wouldn't expect interdentals to participate in this pattern as well. And you can think about that like path is a noun in English that ends in an interdental fricative, which is voiceless. Paths is the plural form of that, so we get the voiceless plural morpheme there, the S at the tail end of a word like paths. So it only applies to stridents where we get the is suffix ending. That's one new feature we have to learn. I'm going to give you 2 other new features we have to learn for place of articulation. In the next lecture, I'm going to walk you through all of them so we get sort of the total inventory that we can play around with when we're doing analysis of phonology patterns. But for now, I'll let you know that when you have any sound that involves the lips in phonology, including both bilabials and labiodentals, these are described by the distinctive feature labial. Anytime I'm putting anything in all caps here, that just means that's the name of a new feature that we're going to play around with. And these in particular will be the names of place features. So labial means involving the lips. It includes both bilabials and labiodentals, and it's p, b, m, f, and v. Stops and nasal and 2 fricatives of the labiodental place of articulation. Dorsal means anything involving the back of the tongue, so that's a cover feature for both palatal consonants and velar consonants as well. So that's k, g, and yod, and I have an oversight here because this also includes engma, so I don't want to forget about that. I just have to figure out how to get that in there. All right, success. You'd think after all this time in isolation I would be better prepared, but no. Okay, so those are both velars and palatals and velars. They're dorsals. Coronal, labial, and dorsal, those are three main place of articulation features in phonology. Okay, so I'm talking about these as kind of a new form of features. Technically, what they'll be known as is as distinctive features. So the reason we're calling them distinctive is because they distinguish between otherwise identical sounds. And we're going to use these features to not only define natural classes of sounds, but also distinguish one sound from another. They kind of have, they're multi-purpose, I guess you could say. Normally, because they are distinctive in this sense, they are preceded by either a plus or a minus in front of the feature name. And that's sort of making the distinction, like could something be plus strident or minus strident? Like an S is plus strident, a theta is minus strident, so that's how they are distinguished from one another. They're two different sounds. And I've got another example here for a different new distinctive feature we have to learn, which is called continuant. So a S is a plus continuant sound, and the continuant just means that you can continue making the sound as long as you want to, or as long as you have air flowing out of your lungs. So S you can make for an extended period of time. A T, however, is minus continuant because you can't keep the air flowing through your mouth consistently as you make a T. It just is kind of one moment in time, right? T versus sa. S is plus continuant, T is minus continuant. That distinguishes stops and fricatives as well as a few other things in our phonemic inventories. I will make a point here, just so you know, that nasals and affricates are also minus continuant things in language. Affricates kind of makes sense because like cha and ja, you can't keep like a cha going for a long period of time, right? Or a ja, you have to include a stop in that, so it has to be a moment in time again. Nasals are only considered continuants because in your mouth you are stopping the flow of air, like for an N or an M or an engma. There's nothing coming out of your lips, right? When you produce that, the air flows through your nose. So it's a bit of a loophole, I guess you could say, a phonological loophole, but nasals are for that reason minus continuant, even though the air continues to flow out through the nose. It's defined by what's happening in the mouth, as I've listed it up here. Okay, so this is sort of where we get to either the atoms or the subatomic particles of language, I guess you could say. So distinctive features, at least according to the theory, are supposed to be the basic building blocks of language. So at some level, we have sentences, and maybe at a level above that, we have things like whole utterances, which could be more than one sentence, or whole conversations. You can keep building up if you want to at that level. But then below sentences, we have words, and then words are made out of morphemes. The morphemes are made out of phonemes, and the phonemes themselves are made out of features. You can kind of think about this going back to the early days of the semester where we talked about duality of patterning, where we have sort of like a small set of phonemes which can make a very large number of different morphemes. You get sort of a similar expansion of possibilities when you go from morphemes to words, or from words to sentences. You can think about how many more sentences you can make than words in a language, because you can put words in all sorts of different combinations to get there. But the smallest set of things that we really have to worry about in language are the distinctive features at the bottom of this. And you can't really go lower than that because this describes sort of individual gestures that get involved in the production of a sound that contrast with other meaningful gestures in language. So because this is sort of the basic building blocks of anything in language, this set of features is supposed to be universal, and we should be able to use it to describe any sound in any language of the world, or at least how they distinguish themselves from one another and how they function together in natural classes as well. So those are the two properties of distinctive features which make them useful. They tell us what contrast a sound can make with other sounds. It's always going to be based on those feature values. And they also will tell us what natural classes a sound can belong to, because they will define how sort of unities between different phonemes, which will enable them to operate together in different phonological rules. So we have learned a few of these already going back. We got continuant, we got strident. I don't want to mess this up too much. And we got these three different place features: coronal, labial, dorsal, so on and so forth. We're going to learn more. We'll save that for next time, but this is basically what features do, are these two things. They determine how a sound distinguishes itself from other sounds, and they also determine how sounds group together. And that's why they're useful, and that's why we're going to have to learn a lot more about them next time. Okay, so that's it for now. Like I said before, when we go to the next lecture, it's going to be going back in time, in real time, to the midst of the pandemic. Glad we're past that by now. I'm also glad we keep able to move forward in this way through this entire semester. So, yeah, I'll see you next time, which is a long time ago.